We're doing a series the next 3 weeks looking at the love of God from the Psalms. And the Psalms is rich with great images of the subject. And every Christian really does need to develop or form from the Bible a theology of love. Every Christian needs to form in their minds. They have a concept or understanding of the love of God and love in general. And the reason for that is that we are made for love relationships. And God's made us for love relationships. At a human level, we're made for love relationships, and also in a divine level, our relationship with God, our relationship to others. At a human one, we know this, that we're made for these relationships in the sense that you see the fragile demeanor of a wife who's trapped in a loveless marriage. She's made for a love relationship, but just not experiencing that in her context. Or you see the uncertainties of children with either unloving, perfectionist, passive, or preoccupied parents. Or you just see the deep gnawing loneliness or pain of loneliness that many experience. That they're made for love relationships, yet not experiencing that love. And the same is true not just on a human level. We know that from a human level, but also from a divine level. We're created for a love relationship with God. And not knowing God's love for us is causes the biggest insecurity in our lives. We have this continuous craving for affirmation, for significance. It comes out of this not knowing this relationship with God, or our intense longing for control or security. Comes out of this not knowing this love relationship with God, or even a deep desire for happiness or satisfaction and fulfillment. Again, comes out of this not understanding this love relationship we should have with God. And you go through the Bible and you start realizing that this is spoken about everywhere. Like Paul writes to the Ephesian church, and he says, "My prayer for you is that you just grasp how amazing God's love is for you in Jesus Christ." That's what his prayer is. That's what he's praying for them. They just understand, somehow get their heads around how amazing and phenomenal the love of God is, the love of Christ is. Wide, high, deep, long. And so I want to explore this in the Psalms in the next few weeks, and particularly here today we look at this little statement that he makes. He just says, "How priceless," this is verse 7, "how priceless is your unfailing love, O God." How priceless is your unfailing love, O God. Now, the context of this is in verse 5 and 6. Before we get into verse 7 and unpack the priceless, unfailing love, or the precious, unfailing love, depending on which version you have, the context comes out of verse 5 and 6, where he says, "Your love, Lord, reaches to the heavens, your faithfulness to the skies, your righteousness is like the highest mountain, your justice like the great deep." And so he's talking about the attributes of God, and he's talking about there's an unsearchableness with it, in the sense that it reaches up to the skies. It's impregnable in the sense that it's so strong, like mountains. It's like the great deep, that's inexhaustible. The attributes of God are incredible and amazing, and the psalmist is using language, poetic language, trying to describe how amazing and how great and how incredible the attributes of God are. The justice, the faithfulness, the righteousness. But then he turns his attention back to love. And he spends some time on it to give it more attention. Not that you couldn't spend time going back to each one of these and spending time on them, because they're vast subjects, they're amazing subjects. Each of these elements are aspects of God. But he comes back to love. And he gives it more attention. And the Hebrew root word here is hesed. Here it's translated in the NIV as unfailing love. Some versions will have it as steadfast love or loving kindness, or the old King James, I think, uses mercy. Some commentators refer to it as covenant loyalty. Probably the best English translation is possibly loyal love. And the thing about it is, it's primarily not a feeling. We often, again, our culture, we look at love and we have this sense that love is about a feeling. Well, primarily love is not a feeling in the Bible. It's actually a self-regulated compulsion. It's God carrying out His commitment and His actions, His purposes and actions. Again, our whole concept of love is culturally conditioned. And our concept of love in our culture doesn't really help us so often, because we often think, when we think of love, people think, it's if a husband says to a wife, "Do you love me?" And they're thinking of romance. They're thinking of romantic dinners. They're thinking of sunset walks on the beach. They're thinking of flowers or things like that. Or in our culture particularly, it's just sex. Which is interesting, because when the Hebrew language and the Greek languages are far more expressive than this, because they talk about sex, they talk about yada, not hesed. Or the Greek has eros. Agape is the word for love. So our English language is so limited. In some ways, one of the greatest ways to see the expression of love that it's talking about here isn't the romantic dinners or the sunset walks on the beach. It's actually the love that is seen when two and a couple are together on their diamond wedding anniversary. That's the sort of love that's sort of pictured here. When they've made vows and said, "To death do us part, we're going to be together. We're better or worse, richer or poorer, sickness or health. We're going to forsake all others and be faithful to each other as long as we both shall live." And there we are, 60 years later, together, faithful to those vows. That's the sort of love Hesed is. It's not just an emotional connection. There's an element of emotion with it, but it's more about intentional commitment. Where God, in His wisdom, sets His affection on people and says, "I'm going to love you. I'm going to love you for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and health. I'm going to love you. And nothing's going to separate me from that love. Nothing's going to break that love that I have for you." And as Christians, you need to understand that. You need to understand that. Because we often fight our doubts, our questions, our insecurities. This lady, Emily Freeman, wrote a book, God's Grace to the Good Girl. She tells a story about a girl called Lucy. Lucy's 8 years old, and her mother was to have another child. Her father, however, was pretty unhappy about the pregnancy and said angrily one day that he wished it wasn't true. As an 8-year-old, Laura wondered about the father felt the same way about her when she was born. 8-year-olds are great interpreters of things. They look at situations and they interpret them. And she began to imagine that, and that was true, that maybe he felt that way about her as well. And so from that day on, she formed an image of herself as unwanted and unloved. But you know what? We're all like that. We all form images and interpret a situation and circumstances just as much as an 8-year-old Laura does. Stuff happens in our lives, and we start questioning, does God really love me here? Or I can't see how God's loving me in this situation. Stuff happens in our lives, and we start questioning it, and we start wondering about it. I think one of the greatest examples of someone breaking through those questions is a man named Jeremiah. And Jeremiah writes some amazing words in the book of Lamentations, and they're probably the only verse, if you can ever quote any verse in Lamentations, these are the verses you'll probably quote. Most of Lamentations are actually quite tragic reading, but these ones, you read this, and he says this in Lamentations 3, verse 22, "Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for His compassions never fail." That's powerful words. It's so powerful words. Because of God's great love, we are not consumed. Yeah, his compassions never fail. Now, you know the context he writes that in? As all his friends and neighbors have been carted off into exile. As the city of Jerusalem has been destroyed and the temple itself has been pulled down. And he can stand there and he's called the weeping prophet. And he can say, I still trust in the faithfulness and the goodness of God and his love. We are not consumed and his compassions never fail. See, God's love for us is not fickle. It's not erratic. It's not inconsistent. It's never failing. And Jeremiah knew that God had a plan and would work out his plan in his love for his people. But what does he say here, going back to the book of Psalms, what does he say about this love, this hesed, this unfailing love? What does he say about it? Well, he says that, he's talked about, the love of God, reaches the heavens, the faithfulness to the skies, the righteousness like the highest mountain, the justice like the great deep. So he's gone from the immense, the unfathomable, the limitless, describing the attributes of God. And again, he turns to love, and he just talks about being intimate and personal, and he just says, how priceless is your unfailing love. How priceless. It's too good to even grasp. It's too good to even grasp. It's so precious. It's to be prized and treasured above anything and everything else. The psalmist is saying God's love is exquisite. It's unique. It's unrivaled. You can't put even a value on this. We have a book in our house. It's probably my favorite book when I was a kid, and my son's reading it lots at the moment, called The 500 Hats of Bartholomew Cubbins. You don't read that book by any chance? Okay, it's a great book. You must get it. It's Dr. Seuss, which just makes it even better. But the story is, what happens in the story is this. Bartholomew Cubbins travels to the city, and he's wearing his lovely hat that's been passed down from generation to generation. And this king, when he arrives he's going to sell some cranberries in the market, but the king happens to be traveling with all his royal carriage and horsemen, and he's traveling through the city, and everyone's lining the streets to welcome the king, and everyone's taking their hats off. And so he lines the street and he takes off his hat, and the king goes zooming past, but then stops. Comes back to Bartholomew Cubbins, who's standing there with a hat in his hand and a hat on his head. And the king shouts orders to his guard and says, and he says, should not a person take off their hat in front of the king? And of course, Bartholomew responds, yes, of course he should. And here's my hat. And then the king says, well, what's one on your head doing? So he takes that off again, and there's another hat. Keeps appearing on his head. And he takes another one off and another one off. And eventually the king says, you've got to come to my palace, and we'll remove that hat for you. And so, he goes to the palace and has to get the hat removed, and he gets another one removed, and it's still a huge pile of hats standing right next to him in front of the throne of the king. And the king says, well, you'll be executed. If you don't remove the hat, we'll remove your head as well. And so he gets taken down to the dungeon to remove his... And the executioner, who's got some morals and integrity, says, well, to be executed, you've got to remove your hat. So he can't get executed. And so he ends up going back. But eventually, it's about 450 odd hats. And the king says, well, the one way to do it is we'll push you off the highest turret. And that will definitely remove your hat and remove your life, possibly as well. And so they get him way up the stairwells. He's going up, and the hats start changing. Eventually, there's a little, ruby starts appearing on the hat. And eventually, by the time he gets to the top steeple, he's got the 500th hat on his head. But it's got this magnificent ruby on the hat. And so here's the king standing there in all his regalia and lovely crown. But the hat on Bartholomew Cubbins is significantly more glorious. And the king just looks at it and says, he just realizes the hat on his head is just nothing in comparison to the hat that is on Bartholomew Cubbins' head. And so he offers to buy it. And somehow that's the end of the hats for Bartholomew Cubbins. But the king sees that it's peerless, that he must have it. And it's more precious than anything else in his kingdom. And so he buys it. And this is the same true about God's love. There's nothing else compared to it. There's nothing else quite like it. It's priceless and peerless and incomparable. And then the psalmist starts unfolding. What does that mean? He talks about here that people, this unfailing love, people will take refuge in the shadow of your wings. What's that? That's your security that you're longing for. And then he says, and you'll share in the wealth of the house. And verse 8, you'll feast on the abundance of your house and you'll drink from the river of delights. What's that? What's sharing in the abundance in the house? It means belonging. It means significance. It means pleasure. It means satisfaction and fulfillment, enjoying God's blessing. All the things you're craving. And then it says you'll drink from the river of delights. Psalm 16, verse 11, it says, in your presence is the fullness of joy, and at your right hand are pleasures forevermore. You're refreshed and you're sustained by the fountain of life, again, that just flows from this unfailing love. As Sally Lloyd-Jones puts it, God's love is never ending, never giving up, never stopping, always forever love. You know what? You can never put a price tag on this sort of love. But the thing is, we look for love in all the wrong places. You have this situation where people go from relationship to a relationship, trying to find significance, meaning, and security. They go looking to the celebrities to give them advice about marriage and relationships, and they can't stay married. The celebrities can't stay married for 5 minutes. Yet, you're looking for love, significance, all in the wrong places. Or you have a kid that's rebelling against his parents and pushing all the boundaries and keeps pushing and pushing and pushing, asking the question, do they really love me? How far will they love me if I keep pushing? But again, the kid's looking for love in the wrong places. Or you're seeking some sort of pleasure or some sort of self-gratifying act, some sort of addiction. Or a wife hoping that if she gets married that it'll finally fill the void and emptiness in her life, and she still ends up disillusioned and despairing. You've got to know that only in God is this love ever found. Where your loneliness is really met, and where your addictions really are broken, and your emptiness is filled, and your angst, your inner angst is pacified. Where the love, the priceless love of God will meet it. And there's an element of brokenness in this world, and we'll always feel this tension of struggle with this, but the love of God will meet it. And the great thing about the love of God, it not only reaches up to the heavens, it reaches down from the heavens. And God sent His own Son down into this world in love, in the most precious and priceless act of love and the known to humanity, where God demonstrates His own love for us in this, yet while we were still sinners, not wanting His love, not wanting Him in our lives, He sent His Son to die for us. And the thing is, as you meditate on that act of priceless love, you will start taking refuge in the shadow of His saving wings. In this priceless love, you drink from the fountain of life and you'll never thirst again, as Jesus speaks to a woman at a well who's gone from relationship to relationship looking for love and finding it in a man who offers her living water. So this end of this year, just reflect upon the amazing love of God. We are all have scars of love. Parents that have failed, marriage struggles, kids that haven't loved us, parents that we have not loved properly. We're scarred with love problems. But we have to go to the one who's the source of all love and start redefining and reshaping ourselves from there. And knowing His love poured out into our hearts through His Holy Spirit to change us. And that is precious, priceless, unfailing love. Amen.